In this video, we're going to examine what is possibly the most extraordinary statement that was made during the trial of Lucy Letby. Now, I know what you're thinking. There are a lot of extraordinary statements in this court case already. I'll let you be the judge of where this ranks. This statement was made on Wednesday, the 26th of October at approximately 11:32 a.m. by Dr. Sandy Bohin, where she made a comparison between the rash involved in her embolism and chickenpox. So in this video, we're going to examine the validity of this. So first of all, I'm going to read to you exactly what was said in court. I think what's come out across the whole of this trial, said Dr. Bohin, is a huge variation on the types of skin change seen by parents, practitioners, nursing practitioners, doctors of these children. And certainly the medical and nursing personnel are very clear that they have not seen changes like this before or since, but that the changes appeared very graphic. So it's interesting, before we go into anything else, she, as I mentioned before, she concedes there's been a huge variation in the types of skin changes. That should throw air embolism out immediately. And what they always rely on is, we'd never seen anything like this before. The staff that worked on the units had never seen anything like this before. That's more to do with the staff than what actually happened, as we now know. So Bohin continues, and so although there is not one single thing that you can say is definitely pathognomic of air embolus, that is a bit like saying that all chickenpox rashes are not different. They are, but you still have chickenpox regardless of whether you have 2 spots or 500. You have got chickenpox and the rash varies, and so the rash with this will vary as well. It will not be identical every single time. That would be clinically impossible. Now, I'm sure a few of you already spilt your drinks at this point, but let's continue. So Ben Meyer says, I'm not going to get caught up in chickenpox, but I am going to suggest that we all know what chickenpox rashes look like. So Bohin says they vary enormously. Meyer says we don't confuse them with an air embolus, do we? And Bohin says no. And Justice Goss says, I don't think that's an appropriate comment, really, Mr. Myers. There we are. And Mr. Myers says, I don't mean to be inappropriate, my lord. I'm trying to make the point about the difference with rashes that we're being told. We don't have any standard course that an air embolus follows, do we, in this case? And then Bohin says, we do, in that the child has a lesion, a skin lesion, and collapses and requires resuscitation. Blah, blah, blah. We've heard it a million times before. Total crap, of course. Now, in this video, we're not going to examine the usual issues with the air embolism diagnosis. We're just purely going to examine this chickenpox analogy and the multitude of problems with making such a statement. The first fundamental problem is that it assumes the very thing that is in dispute. With chickenpox, you begin with a disease that has an established clinical phenotype. The number of lesions can vary enormously while the lesions retain recognizable characteristics. As an example, the CDC describes chickenpox as a characteristic involving eruption. Macules become papules, then vesicles and crusts, with lesions occurring in successive crops and commonly existing at different developmental stages simultaneously. Does this particular, often non-specific skin discoloration provide evidence that the baby suffered an air embolism in the first place? Bohin has conceded that there are multiple presentations that eliminates that part of the evidence immediately. You cannot answer this proposition by saying that manifestations of an air embolism can vary, because you first have to establish that those manifestations actually belong to air embolism. This makes the analogy circular reasoning. These babies had air emboli. Their various skin changes therefore show how variable air embolism skin changes can be. Those various skin changes then support the proposition that the babies had air emboli. Basically, it's rubbish. I suspect that by now Evans and Bohin know that it's rubbish. If they don't know that it's rubbish by now, then they must be stupid, and I certainly don't think that they're stupid. Her chickenpox example is also based on 2 spots versus 500 spots. That's variation in the extent of the same phenomenon. But the Letby evidence involved apparently quite different descriptions of skin appearance, as Bohin concedes herself, such as rashes, mottling, discoloration, pallor, pink areas, purple areas, blotching, different colours of discoloration, and so on. The issue was in no way analogous to two manifestations of the characteristic sign versus 500 manifestations of the characteristic sign of chickenpox. It was much closer to multiple substantially different looking skin phenomena are all being treated as compatible with the same diagnosis, even though they very obviously are not. And of course, Dr. Lee's evidence directly addressed this. Even the Court of Appeal judgment records him saying that pallor, cyanosis and mottling have many causes and are not themselves diagnostic of air embolism. His report specifically said that pale or white patchiness could occur because of hypothermia, sepsis, allergy, viral illness, immune reactions, and other processes. Suppose mottling occurs commonly in sick premature babies undergoing cardiovascular collapse, which I think is broadly accepted this is the case. This could be consistent with air embolism, but if it's equally consistent or considerably more commonly associated with sepsis, hypoxia, circulatory failure, temperature instability, etc., its evidential value for distinguishing air embolism from those alternatives is essentially non-existent. The court records Dr. Lee saying that air embolism is a very rare and specific condition. Pallor, cyanosis, and mottling have many possible causes. Those appearances should not by themselves diagnose air embolism. Only the particular bright pink vessels against cyanosed skin appearance were said by him to be diagnostically specific, and air embolism should not be diagnosed simply by excluding other causes and deciding that air embolism remains. The court ultimately answers this by saying that Evans and Bohin weren't using the ordinary discoloration diagnostically, they were using it as something merely consistent with air embolism together with other evidence. In paragraph 187 of the Court of Appeal verdict, it stated this is why Lee's evidence is aimed at a mistaken target. But if a sign is so non-specific that it cannot discriminate air embolism from numerous ordinary causes of circulatory collapse, what evidential work is it actually doing in the so-called constellation of features? The same thing obviously cannot be said about a rash in the condition of chickenpox. The question regarding the evidential work that is being done by discoloration is never really addressed in the court case. In fact, Dr. Evans has repeatedly claimed that he didn't even take the discoloration into consideration when diagnosing. Considering that Bohin read his reports and conclusions before writing her report, we can assume that she didn't include discoloration in her conclusions or process either. This really affects the question of what exactly they did take into consideration. Of course, we know this because Dr. Evans has told us that he considered a failure to resuscitate and a sudden collapse to be diagnostic of air embolism. Essentially total nonsense that we've just heard Dr. Bohin repeat. As this could be associated with multiple conditions, and there is no evidence that Dr. Evans ruled these out meaningfully, then it's quite reasonable to describe this as total nonsense, particularly considering the very evident clinical signs of the infants, which appear to have been completely disregarded. Ultimately, in the Letby case, whether the babies had air embolism was precisely the fact requiring proof. You therefore cannot assume air embolism and use the variability among the alleged cases to establish that almost any observed discoloration is compatible with it. This doesn't even make sense, let alone does it have any clinical validity. That all has to be explained to understand one of the reasons why this suggestion is absurd in relation to chickenpox. The next reason is that the analogy related to chickenpox conflates variability in severity with variability in appearance. Bohin's 2 spots or 500 example is principally about how many lesions a person has. Chickenpox lesions still have recognized characteristics and a recognized evolution that I've described already, often with lesions at several stages simultaneously. The Letby problem was completely different. The descriptions themselves varied, including pallor, mottling, pinkness, purple-red patches, blotchiness, general discoloration, localized discoloration, and so on. That is variability of phenotype, not merely quantity. Chickenpox, indeed, has an independently established causal link between disease and rash. We know independently that the varicella zoster virus causes the characteristic chickenpox eruption. Doctors are not inferring that relationship afresh from each patient's spots. If they see those spots, they know that it's chickenpox. With the alleged air embolism cases, the disputed question was precisely whether these particular skin changes were caused by air embolism. The analogy, therefore, effectively imports a certainty that has certainly not been demonstrated. There are many other potential criticisms as well, which I'm not going to discuss in this video because I want to finish here with the main problem. When someone is suffering with chickenpox, there is always a rash. Indeed, the rash is the defining characteristic of chickenpox. The NHS describes the main symptom of chickenpox as an itchy, spotty rash. The CDC likewise describes ordinary varicella as producing a generalized rash that progresses from macules to papules to vesicles and then crusts, as described earlier. In children, the rash is often the first sign of the illness. Indeed, I suffered with chickenpox when I was younger, and I certainly remember an itchy, spotty rash. I'm sure many people listening to this will have suffered with it as well. It was impossible to be vaccinated at that time. Yes, I am that old. Indeed, even vaccinated people can get breakthrough chickenpox, and this might be extremely mild, but there can still be as many as 50 lesions and sometimes even more. In fact, I think the scenario of just having 2 spots, someone medically qualified would have to comment on this, but I certainly had a lot more than 2 spots when I had chickenpox. I can say that. However, it's pretty common to get red spots and few or maybe a handful of blisters, even when you're vaccinated. Even in this scenario, a skin eruption remains universally characteristic of this clinical illness. Indeed, a pox, that's why it's called chickenpox, is any viral or infectious disease marked by distinctive skin rash, eruptions, or pustules. That's why it's chickenpox. Everyone knows the things that come through your skin when you have chickenpox are pox. That's why it's called chickenpox, in common with other conditions such as smallpox and mpox, formerly known as monkeypox. In the unlikely event that there was a court case focused around whether or not someone had chickenpox, the evidence would be, how do you know that they had chickenpox? Well, they had chickenpox. With chickenpox, you will have a rash 100% of the time. If you don't have a rash, or pox, as it should be more accurately described, you do not have chickenpox. In the case of an air embolism, there will be a fleeting indication in approximately 10% of cases involving a very specific type of discoloration. This specific Lee sign will not appear in the vast majority of cases, and when other types of discoloration appear, that doesn't mean that they are diagnostic of air embolism, quite the opposite in fact. As mentioned in a previous video and my book, the chances of having the extent of discoloration cited in this court case, in the number of instances of air embolism alleged, is astronomical to the point of being impossible. This also indicates that neither Evans nor Bohin had properly read the academic papers on which they relied, because this was specifically outlined in the 1989 report of Lee and Tanswell. It is further explained in my recently published book, Reasonable Doubt, examining the case of Lucy Letby, in the following passage. The final point of Dr. Lee could even be considered an understatement. Discoloration and mottling was cited repeatedly throughout the court case as diagnostic factors, in 14 out of 15 air embolism collapses. Discoloration was also erroneously cited in other infants, but if one sticks to the cases for which it could conceivably be relevant, then there was a phenomenally unlikely 93% prevalence across these collapses, compared with the 10% that would be expected. This is extraordinarily unlikely to happen. Something that should occur once or twice across 15 incidents very rarely happens 14 times. Indeed, the odds are astronomically high, trillions to 1 based on a simple study that I conducted. Now, I want you to compare that to a situation with chickenpox, in which there should be a rash 100% of the time, and if you don't have a rash, then you don't have chickenpox. So Ben Myers did reference this in his closing statement, so I'll read this out to you. Discoloration identified slightly grey and darker than the rest of her body around her abdomen, but certainly nothing to match what was to be expected from an air embolus, or, let me say, what was to be expected of it at the start of this trial. By this time in the evidence, really, we're going to the point where the experts have jettisoned any principled application of a theory, and you saw it happen when we got to discussions about chickenpox and things like that. Do you remember Dr. Bohin saying it was like chickenpox? Inaudible chickenpox. It's like that with their embolus. How does she know that? Where has that come from? That's literally a theory invented in the course of this case for the purpose of sustaining this prosecution because we didn't start with that. That could have been handled better, but I'm sure you get the general idea. And then he returned to it later on in with regard to child O. So this is all part of the discussion of child O. So let's go back to discoloration. Again, there are many and varied descriptions for comparison, ladies and gentlemen. It was at this point of the case that there was the exchange with Dr. Bohin, where we were suggesting to her that we'd lost sight of any type of principled standard to apply. And she, if you remember, said, well, it's rather like the business with chickenpox. We all know what chickenpox looks like, so we can spot chickenpox marks. The point is that's right. We do know what chickenpox looks like. We don't have much to go on with what air embolus discoloration looks like. We can't do it outside this paper. And we had reached, at this point in the case, a stage where, and you'll see this in the evidence, literally everything could be used by the experts if they wanted to say, this is unusual, even if the clinicians hadn't identified it as unusual. Now, when the Court of Appeal dealt with this chickenpox issue, which is in paragraph 97, they just quote what Dr. Bohin said and make no further comment about it at all. They just quote this thing about 2 spots of 500. It's like saying you have chickenpox, etc., etc., and they don't seem to believe that this is worthy of further comment. Now, the chickenpox conversation and analogy did appear in contemporary reporting of the time. This is in the Daily Mail, but this is the only reference that I've been able to find. For example, this is in The Independent, and you see here some discussion of Sandy Bohin telling the court that there were no innocent cause for what occurred with child O, but there's no reference to chickenpox, just a reference to a small discoloured mark. Bear in mind as well that this is in relation to child O, for which supposedly Lucy Letby had punched child O, which caused bleeding. The presentation of this infant nevertheless followed the classical clinical pattern of a ruptured subcapsular hematoma. Lucy Letby then injected air into the stomach of the infant, which caused collapse in some unclear manner. Dr. Evans then abandoned this mechanism, changing his opinion in court to Lucy Letby injecting air into a vein, even though this would produce completely different symptoms and clinical presentation. Dr. Evans then asserted that the infant died due to the injection of air, not blood loss or anything related to the subcapsular hematoma. So in conclusion, firstly, what happened in court is the following. Myers asked for an objective constant. Bohin concedes there is no constant description of the discoloration. She answers that problem by invoking variability with chickenpox, and Myers points out that chickenpox nevertheless has a recognizable established phenotype. These are all reasons why this is a ridiculous comparison. Bohin cannot surely intellectually believe that this is a valid medical comparison. This should never be used in a court case. In fact, there is no situation in which this comparison should be used. But that's not surprising, perhaps, because this is a court case that already features a massive fuss about Lucy Letby supposedly lying about her pajamas when millions of people have now seen her being arrested in worse circumstances, literally in bed, still in her night clothes, essentially asleep. Whether or not Lucy Letby owned a shredder, whether or not Lucy Letby could remember when she was born, reversed and completely worthless swipe card data that we know has absolutely no merit whatsoever, but was nevertheless a central aspect of the court case. Worthless eyewitness accounts that contributed absolutely nothing to the understanding of the case because no one had witnessed any wrongdoing. Daniel Stonier pretending to be Lucy Letby and Nick Johnson pretending to be Daniel Stonier, even though the original interviews conducted by the police were available on video. Dr. Ravi Jairam claiming to have caught someone virtually red-handed. Prosecutor Nick Johnson claiming that the mother of child E caught Lucy Letby red-handed when it is agreed that no one witnessed any wrongdoing. Dr. Jairam's strange and shifting recollections, which seem to be getting in rather a lot of hot water at the moment, and deservedly so. Incompetent hospital staff being relied upon as witnesses of fact, when it is very clear that they were not competent enough to manage and run the unit. Critical documents such as the Royal College of Paediatrics report and the outcome of the hospital grievance procedure being hidden from the jury. Lucy supposedly punching an infant in the stomach. Lucy supposedly using an indeterminate tool on an infant, down the infant's throat. prosecution allegations moving around all over the place during the court case, dates and mechanisms of attack changing both during and after the court case, every judicial decision going in favour of the prosecution, nonsensical hypotheses, a worthless shift chart that is completely ridiculed by anyone who knows anything about how such a shift chart should be constructed, countless inferences being made throughout the court case from this shift chart, alongside an array of absolute nonsense, anecdotal evidence. And now, on top of all that, we have a prosecution witness comparing air embolism to chickenpox. Now, as I say, this could be the most ridiculous thing, the most astonishing thing that was stated during the entire court case. I'll leave you to decide where it should rank. And the last thing that I want people to understand when reflecting on this debacle of a court case, on this debacle of a police investigation, is that you can be convicted in a case like this. I can be convicted in a case like this. Everyone watching this video could be convicted in a case like this. It is not inconceivable that you could be convicted in a worse case than this. If you think something like this can't happen to you, then you're living in a state of delusion. What happened to Lucy Letby can absolutely happen to everyone that watches this video.